are the
What are the
statements? Yeah.
So
For
how
example,
fundamental? Okay, composition in juggling. What do we even mean by that then? Let's be really basic. What is the composition?
yeah.
So it's construction, or is it more open?
Are you conceiving composition as something which is previous to action? Or do you conceive composition as something that shows itself in some kind of production that has come out of improvisation or whatever? I wouldn't know, because to me it was quite an important thing which I said before we started the exam things here in the hall, where I said, or to my mind at least, there is a kind of evolution of consciousness in mankind. And when you talk of composition, you are either back in the time where people had to conceive what they were going to do, or you are in a modern time where we have come through this needle's eye, where we kind of have so good hearing, so we hear what is necessary right now. And if we can hear that, we might even hear what is necessary then or hereafter, and then we can start to compose. But is the composition just my ideas? I want to create this or that, with no kind of context, which makes what I'm going to do necessary? Then I'm not so interested in the concept of composition.
So the composition starts at the moment that you begin, not before.
This is not the point. The point is the composition. I do compose because I know what is necessary. I think the concept necessity is a beautiful one for an artist. There is some, I know so much. There is some quotation from Goethe or somewhere where he sees the classical art, the Greece classical art, and he says about the piece, which is I think Nike or something, and he says, here is necessity, here is God. And yeah, okay, we are composing out of a context, so before we start to compose, we ask ourselves, why? Why?
And why is that a personal question? Why am I composing now, or is it already the larger, is it the time?
This is absolutely depending. I mean, from a 20-year-old one, you can hardly have the expectation that he or she should be in a situation where she or he is completely aware of all the needs of the world, kind of. No, of course not. Not even from 60-year-old guys you can hope for that. But you will know your own format. You will know in what amount or in what largeness you are working. I mean, you tell a good night tale to a little kid that shall go to sleep. The context is this. Or you are going to perform at the UN meeting on world peace for all the leaders, and then there is something else, etc., etc. And the whole thing which the Clowns Without Borders are doing, I mean, they are conceiving a context all the time. And then maybe they are not composing in an intensity which I maybe would like them to do. Still, the idea that there is a kind of at least a social necessity, if not a spiritual necessity, for what we are doing, absolutely gives an alibi for composition.
Okay.
I would say.
But then that's a very contemporary position to be in.
Yeah.
So that's saying that's the position now. And so if we go back to the classical arts, maybe then was composition before more of a structure beforehand, and now it's becoming more.
They
in the moment?
were doing the exercise.
Mm-hmm.
They were training composition as such,
Yeah.
and that was absolutely okay.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, fantastic guys like Johann Sebastian Bach. I mean, this is the composer in a way, if we talk
It's
of
a name I've been
composition.
trying not to say in my questions yet. So yeah.
Yeah. He exercised the art of composition without any relation or regard to anything else but music. We, I think, do not have this liberty anymore to do our little thing. We have to kind of do this thing which in Swedish papers should always be when you apply for money, etc., which is called omvärldsanalys, which is world context analysis, which then gives the background for the motivation.
Mm-hmm.
Then you can, or I could suggest that there are two aspects of this whole question. It seems that manipulation of objects is such a new area to us. So the whole question about our relation to things motivates that we go into composition without world context analysis and stay by the, what is this? And we have been discussing several times, and if there were glass balls, or if there were levitating objects, or, I mean, there are all kinds, and if we do it, the whole thing in water, or. There are so many questions about man and matter that should be explored. So I'm happy to go in for a project of composition for manipulation, which is without the whole idea, only with the world context idea that man knows much too less about his relation to things and objects. And then it's okay, and then we could start again. After this prologue.
Sure. So the first step is to just make it is to work out what it relates to with objects and person, man, and object. So the first step is almost the 19th century step.
Yeah.
And then the second step would be the context.
Yeah.
Step.
And then there are many contexts,
Mm-hmm.
and Tilde's context is not a bad one. I mean, Tilde's context is what does these circus disciplines do to those who perform or do things, and what do they do as an impact on those who watch.
Mm-hmm.
And then, even further, one can already know that both music and juggling has a special effect on the part of the mind which is doing mathematics or arithmetics or whatever methods there are, geometrics or ethics, all kinds of these ethics. So, of course, then there is a utilitarian track, which I will try to avoid as far as I can, because I detest utilitarianism. But of course, it is good that kids juggle because it clears their minds throughout. I mean, not only their minds, but their minds.
Yeah.
And that is good. So if someone gives time for that, okay, and that one who gives time for that is of course helped that there are guys who are dealing with composition. I would very much like if the guys, that is you, who deal with composition would put a particular interest into the differences of things. Wood, plastic, virtuality, iron, glass, whatever, all these things, because they are so unattended to, and the world is so full of junk. The world is so completely full of junk that we can hardly put down our feet anymore, there's heaps of junk everywhere, because man didn't care about things.
Mm-hmm. Oh, good. So, there you go. Okay, cool. So, but let's steer this a little way again. So you mentioned, so again, it's nice because it keeps branching out into different things. So we have a clear, it's like an attitude, like, so what's our attitude towards this object, not as the object, but as more, the texture, the tactileness, like maybe tactile is the kind of word. So we're starting at a point that's less, is it less physical then, to start to look at the nature of objects? Is there, are we getting then into more of
is there a spiritual aspect on
Yes.
matters?
Mm-hmm.
There is this thing also, which is very basic and fundamental to me, and that is the first, second, third person thing in the grammars.
Mm-hmm.
And then he says, Martin Buber, you are always completely in yourself when you say I or you,
Mm-hmm.
and you are never ever completely in yourself when you use third person. When you say he or she or it, you objectify and you put yourself outside. And to me it seems juggling is a very good way to not be in third person,
Mm-hmm.
to have a personal relation, you bottle kind of, we the bottle and me, or whatever.
Yeah.
And I really think juggling is a way to come near to what is matter, both physically and spiritually.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe one of the best ways, actually. Sculpture, of course, is also interesting, but then it's not in time in the way that juggling is,
Okay, yeah.
which is perfect.
Mm-hmm. And by that you mean that when you say in time, you mean the fact that it's watching juggling is something which is happening in that moment, as opposed to a sculpture which is finished.
Yeah, or a process going on up to a certain.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah.
I mean, juggling belongs to the time arts.
Mhm.
Dance, music, juggling,
Yeah.
these are the time arts, and maybe you can call in for more circus arts into that area.
Mhm.
Performative arts, they used to say, but I think time arts is a much better word, because the image is moving, and when it has moved, it's not there anymore.
Mhm.
And this is important, I think, time arts.
So you mentioned music as one of the time arts now,
Yeah.
and you said before that juggling perhaps works the same areas of the brain as music does,
Yeah,
certainly
I-
structurally, but you also mean emotionally. I think.
Yeah, I think so.
Mm-hmm.
I think so. I couldn't understand otherwise why I am so absolutely fond of juggling.
Mm-hmm.
Really, when I watch these guys down here now, or also earlier, I find myself to be a sort of person who prefers juggling to all the other circus
Mhm.
arts, which is, of course, I am biased, or I am constructed like that, but it is, I think, that the juggling is a kind of image of music.
Okay. And so do you think then that there's, because then the question, if we wanted to be very practical with our research, for instance, would it be a reasonable starting point to think of, because obviously there's a history of musical composition, so do you think some of the structures within that are possibly relevant, or is it different visual?
You already have them.
Mhm.
I mean, these guys, the Bachs and Beethovens, etc., they have already put that into your bones and flesh and muscles.
Okay.
So you don't have to worry. If you find yourself doing a Bach piece
Mhm.
with your balls or clubs or whatever, then interesting. But more interesting, of course, is you just juggle along, and then if you possibly can, you start to sing in the same time, or you watch your juggling film and you take up your fiddle and you try to follow, or you find a good fiddler and you tell him, I will now start juggling and you will start fiddling, and let's see what happens. and then the compositorial principles will expose themselves. You might get lost in the classical music or the classical way of doing music, which might stop you from taking the steps ahead that could now be taken. I mean, all music after John Cage is something else than all music before John Cage, in a way. Or you could take any name, only I happen to remember his name now, and his clock and all. And I think the composition necessary now has to do with the fact that we are musically free. I think we are musically free, which also could be said we are musically lost, and we have to find. And I don't think we'll find that by Beethoven. We might find it by juggling, which is this interesting thing with these objects, and they have different weight, for example. So they come up and down in different speeds. And now it comes to me that, of course, I would like to see 3 balls, one of iron, one common ball, and one of wood. And how do you do this? Because they have different speeds.
Yeah, different speeds, and then that gets as well like different feelings.
Yeah.
So like throwing an iron ball, or like catching iron and catching wood. It's like,
yeah. And we will learn about the kind of composition that you are looking for by not having focus just on composition, but again
on all the elements.
Yeah, good old Schiller. Go back to play. Man is only completely man when he plays, and only when he plays he's completely man. You're human. Yes. And of course, and juggling is playing to so far an extent that please don't get too sincere and drop your chins on the stomachs with now sincere composition studies, but do unsincere composition studies. It's much more fun. And I mean, what I saw in Berlin and what I saw with Jay and Robert some years ago about, and what I saw with those 2 girls on the vertical rope, Linnea and Elina, and the musicians from Musikhögskolan, it tells me quite a lot about what kind of relation there is between improvisation and composition. And I don't think that we can afford to leave out the improvisation part when we are studying composition. It's not possible.
And is it possible once? So would it be possible if you film? Okay, so just like a really like banal example, would it be possible to extrapolate composition from watching an improvisation?
Yes.
Or, yes.
Yes, for sure. For sure. Some guys have it in them. You can see dancers that have it in them. You can see jugglers that have it in them. That what they do is this necessity thing when they improvise. And then, of course, you can extrapolate or understand or get a feeling for how composition goes in this. You could see on Victor's piece here, the individual parts were quite compositorial, and the dramaturgy of the whole thing was kind of thought out. So the compositorial know-how was in his juggling, but not in his layout for the whole thing. Which, to my understanding, has to do with his devotion to Olle Strandberg and his neck, which kind of took over. So he made a neck piece. But I mean, yes, you can absolutely find. But then, again, can there ever be general principles anymore?
Because that's the question. Because so what you mentioned now is you have the composition and the structure on top can damage it. So is that, so that's the question, is that a fundamental problem? Can we no longer put a structure on our composition?
I think for sure we can. For sure we can. Only the structure you can put on something is entirely different from what anyone else could.
Mm-hmm.
So how is he, she helped by extrapolating something out of your things? This is to a far extent what I have with these guys here, that I know for sure that there is something that any of them, no, not any of them, there is something which just can come out into the world through this person,
mm-hmm.
and by no one else. So I have to try to help them to become artists that do their thing, and not general art,
mm-hmm.
because I don't think we have any interest in general art anymore, not at all.
Mm-hmm.
So composition, so how can we together learn about composition? We have to find out what are kind of general principles of composition as compared to what kind of composition do I have in me.
Mm-hmm.
So there is much for you to do.
We have
a lot to do here.
We have to first answer for the whole of humanity before we can answer for ourselves.
Yeah, and then you'll have to take care that any of you is kind of a universe in that size.
Yeah.
So back. But it's absolutely it's composition. I would say a good idea is to focus on the relation between improvisation and composition.
Mm-hmm.
And a good idea is to focus on the relation between musicians and jugglers.
Mm-hmm.
I don't say music.
Emotional, yes, so musicians, not music and juggling.
No?
Musicians and jugglers.
Yeah, particularly that.
So that's more than presumably an emotional relationship rather than a structural or...
Yeah, but it's also a relationship that happens.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not good enough that you love Louis Armstrong. You have to do something with him, or he with you, or you together, or so.
Good. So this is not a sidetrack, but a related thing, because there's the Stravinsky's quote, which is that basically the composition does not exist in musical theory, that it's only deducted from afterwards, and that's a similar feeling to what we're talking about here. Then, in fact, that it's possible to extrapolate backwards. But in Stravinsky's case, then he extrapolates backwards and has a theory. So, should we even be trying to look at good work of individuals, whatever that means, okay, and extrapolate back and find general principles? So are we looking for things in common, or is it something different?
I really love that guy, and there is this booklet, this little book where his American assistant director kind of interviewed him, and I think it's called Poetic of Composition or something. Absolutely recommendable.
Amazon?
Yeah, really, it's so good, and Stravinsky says so many good things. But he's a guy in his time.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And he's a guy in a time where they find themselves lost in relation to what the classicals could give.
Mm-hmm.
But there is also a coming time.
Yeah.
There is also a future. And we are in this grey abyss of forming consciousness without just feeling that it hems our activity capacity. But I am sure that there is a time coming where consciousness and activity gladly go together. So if you feel the urge to compose. We are all different in this aspect. We are not at the same point in history. We are not at the 13th of February 2008, all of us. Some of us are 2500 and some of us are still 1935, etc., etc. So and we have to respect this.
Okay.
This is also a necessity. We should be happy for the guys that hold us together, and we should be grateful to the guys that are so far ahead that we can hardly be in the same room as they are, because they are okay. But they are kind of making way.
They're as important.
Yes, as important. So Stravinsky, yes, but not only.
Yeah.
Not only, but what Danny tried down there is, of course, far ahead of what he could do as a presentation, but that he tried to do it.
Okay.
So he was far ahead of his own time. He was trying to do something which he, as best, maybe can do when he's 70.
Yeah.
But and someone else is doing something which is much more as it was 10 years ago or whatever. And all these things should be there.
Yeah. So it's not a question of quality. It's just a question of different inputs.
Yeah, I would go so far as to say it's a question of different biographies. He's there, she's here.
Sure.
So, and then when you are going to do something together, like composition for manipulation research, maybe you should try to locate yourselves. Where am I? Where am I? Where am I?
Before one even begins.
Yeah, or successively you might find out different things. I mean, if you start to ask yourself a question today, after 7 years you might sum up. So you won't get any correct answers, but you will get interesting answers every day.
Not sure we have that much time.
But you'll have that would be a modern. That would be a modern thing, that you give yourself so much time. If this is a commitment for a couple of years, yeah, I would like that. I would really like that.
So there's time to answer all those, no, not to answer, there's time to place all those aspects.
Yes.
There's time to place oneself, and then oneself in relation to the group, and the group in relation to the society, and the society.
Yeah, and in the end maybe everything will fall off but your relation to yourself, but that's good enough for me. Absolutely. Absolutely good enough for me. So it's okay.
One thing we found in the first research project was that there was maybe another part of it I didn't explain, which is maybe interesting to talk about a little bit, is that at least in trying to define what is manipulation and what is good and bad and trying to make some decisions, we found that it's very easy to know what is good for ourselves, and it's very easy to see, and in most ways it's very easy to see what is good in other people's work, but it's almost impossible to try to communicate to somebody if they don't innately understand it or just naturally get it. So we'd be looking at compositions or whatever we did, and we say, yes, this is good, and I think we would generally agree, either because we felt it ourselves and we could directly relate to it, or we saw it as being good and we could relate to it in some other way.
Yep.
But if somebody didn't agree with us, we were really hard-pressed to explain to them what we were talking about. And that was also the point of the first research, was to try to make some things we could actually communicate. Is this right?
Yeah.
With people who didn't. So there was a teaching aspect to it, but the teaching aspect was more also for ourselves to learn about it. I don't think the focus was so much on us trying to figure out our own work in that moment for ourselves, to try to define it more for ourselves, but it was more to externalize it to the world in general. Yeah. Can we talk about that point just a little bit in terms of composition? Because you had mentioned a few times now about how, since it is so much about ourselves and it's inside ourselves and these relationships, these personal things, how can we? I mean, again, this isn't worded correctly. I have a million questions already from everything you've said. But how can we talk a little bit about how to? Because these feelings are natural when they occur, and we recognize them as such. But if you don't have these feelings naturally, or what am I saying?
Well,
take this and run with it, man.
If you have people in different times. So if I'm here
yeah.
and I'm working with someone who's in this time,
Yes.
a little bit ahead of me, how do they still need to understand my time?
It is over 100 years ago. It is over 100 years ago that some guy wrote a book which was called Jenseits von Gut und Böse. On the other side of good and bad. I would absolutely, I mean, I haven't thought this through at all, at least not in this discussion. I would absolutely try to avoid these two concepts, good and bad. They are taking you astray immediately, because this is, until you kind of really, like through glass, can see the qualities of each and every one in the gang. You are helplessly lost on this question.
Mm-hmm.
How does he emotionally, what are the conditions under which he emotionally reacts to this thing as different from mine? Not possible. So if we could stick to the idea of necessity instead of good and bad.
Yeah, I mean, just so you know, we totally failed.
Yeah, but you cannot but.
Yeah.
You cannot but, and it might create also social disturbances to deal with this matter. So forget it. Leave it to the guys 300 years ahead. They might have something with that to do, or it will be definitely out. It might be definitely out. I need this to do that. I don't need that. It seemed to me that that part was too long. Okay, not good or bad, it was too long. And I can show how it was too long. Or we didn't see much of that, which was very interesting. And I can tell why I want more of that to come out. Not talking about quality, not good or bad. Dangerous and won't take you anywhere, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So there are so many others. I mean, I hate utilitarianism, but the kind of inner utilitarianism of a composition is something else. This is a necessary part, and to accustom oneself with necessities. Then, of course, going back to what you said much earlier, asked much earlier, or whatever, then, of course, the classical music might teach you something, not through analyzing it, but to listen to it again and again and again and again. And then Bach is the best, because he's a minimalist. Even though this music is whoa, whoa, whoa. But if you listen to his organ works, for example, there is not one note that shouldn't be there. And you take it away and you can hear it immediately. Huh! Something was missing. And you take, and then the classical picture art as well. I mean, imagine a cornfield of Van Gogh, and imagine that all the yellow is instead, which is now very warmly yellow, often is in. Imagine that it is instead lime yellow. Etc., etc. We can do strange things. You can take photos of each other, and you can take a photo of Jay sitting like this, and then you, in your Photoshop, you take away Jay's hand and you put in my hand or your hand instead. You take your hand and Jay's, and you say, no, this is not this is not as should be. And then one can see what should be or what shouldn't be without calling it with the evil names of bad and good, which are evil names.
But that's also good because that's not good. But
3, 2.
So that's good. Well, not good, but interesting.
Yeah.
It was better the first time for me too. You
2.
So you answered something I was going to ask actually, but I just wanted to say it, so I have it out now. Necessity. You mentioned with the Bach, for instance, you take away one piece, you notice it falls. So necessity is always it's the minimum. It's paring down.
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. I mean, then maybe you should try some of the romantics instead of Bach, and you will see the same thing, because in a rich and full composition, it's hard. It's more difficult to distinguish that one note is missing. Of course, that's what I meant with take Bach, because it's so minimalistic that you will immediately feel it or notice it. Whereas on a Mahler piece or a Brahms piece, there is so much happening that if some of this is not happening, it was probably necessary, but you would hardly miss it in the same way. And then there is, of course, more and less world context necessity to different pieces of art. So one has to kind of appreciate a composition in its original context, or something like that. Yeah. We should try to get back to juggling composition. Because it's so interesting.
Yeah. There's too many. There's so many other things. So we can come back to. Would you have a question, please?
I mean, I'm sorry to be mean like this and throw different things at you, but also when we talk about composition with juggling, we're also assuming that it's an art, or we can speak about it in the same context, or have some sort of context inside of language. Can I be really mean and just ask you, why is juggling art?
Yes, you can.
Because, I mean, without any context or personal input. Yeah?
Yeah. The object, to my mind, the object of art is to show not what is, but what could be. All the expansion of our humanity that could be, and even could be to the benefit of any man, I would call art. Juggling for sure is an unexplored area of art as art, because in some old time juggling was merely entertainment, or merely techniques, or merely individual show-off, or whatever. But to you guys, juggling is something which you want to show the world. You want to show it to people because you have the feeling that, yeah, they will like this. I like it, and I can do it in a way that they like it. And by now we know that this is true because I like it and I don't do it. Juggling is art. Singing is art. I mean, only no one thought of juggling as an art a while ago. But I can hardly imagine anyone denying it. I can hardly imagine anyone denying it, that it is an art. If you do what is in it and not only what is in you. This is good, yeah. In the old times, guys like, up to at least, Michelangelo, and even up to be exact, Rembrandt, they used the colors to say something, but they used them. The colors were kind of enslaved into the minds and hands of painting artists. And then comes Kandinsky and his gang, and they turn this whole thing over and ask, how can I serve you blue or red? Or what do you want to say, yellow? And how can I, as a painter, be a mediator of what yellow wants to say? And as long as you have this humble attitude to juggling, what does these objects want to say when they move? Not what do I want to say with these objects when I move them, but what do they want to say when they move? Then you are absolutely artists, and juggling is absolutely an art. And I could fight any guy on that. Not a problem.
And so to, again, ask the slightly painful question perhaps of leading that. So is that answer because juggling is at the point it is now? So juggling is getting to the point where painting was 100 years ago? Or are all arts now at that point? So
all arts.
Mm-hmm.
I would say all arts. To me, it is easy to conceive art as a mother and the arts as her kids, and some kids are young and some kids are older, and juggling is a young kid, and in itself it is probably in some kind of estimable age, but that is very uninteresting because you are not in that age, but you are conscious humans who know a lot about art history and contemporary stuff and juggling worldwide and whatever. So it is, all arts are in this situation. What one could say about all arts, as for all arts, is that in the classical time of the Greece, in Hellas, about year 0 or so, or earlier, there was one art that was the principal art of that time. And you go on in times and you will find that there are different arts. And in the Greece time it was absolutely the architecture, and in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance it was absolutely the painting, and in our time it's absolutely the music, which is the kind of leading art that can help all the other arts. The nurse art of our time is music. We all, whether we paint or sculpture or juggle or dance, we can all learn a lot about what we are doing from the music. And thus it is interesting with juggling who I would say, who is so close to Big Sister music. So they love each other so much. And thus juggling can learn quite a lot from music, and music really loves to teach juggling, in a way.
So we're actually at exactly the right moment in history to be
Yay!
asking these questions.
Yay!
It's a good time to be alive.
It's a good time to be a juggler. It's the best.
Little more. Okay. Again, like I feel bad. I think it's kind of what Jay was saying as well. But we should perhaps push more towards answering specific questions. As you brought up again, okay, we should get back to composition.
Mm-hmm.
So let's see where's a good way to push back towards that. Okay. I think it's okay. So we need to find, because at the moment we have there's two. They're not contradictory, but they're a little bit off balance at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
We have because we've established now, or there's a feeling now that we have a very strong connection with music. but at the same time, we don't want to get too close to that in terms of composition technique, perhaps. So it's finding that balance between how can we relate still to music and take that is that perhaps a starting block, or should we begin bam where we are with the juggling? Should we start in the moment of us?
What you should.
No, yeah,
For sure, I cannot tell you what you
it's
should.
Very bad words.
I never would do that. To me, this iron, plastic, wood thing is absolutely a starting point.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the different characters, textures, or whatever of matters,
Mm-hmm.
of things is one starting. I think you'll have to. The music thing will come.
Mm-hmm.
Don't think too much about the music thing. The music thing thinks about you, so you don't have to worry about that.
And if we are helping these textures, so we could say that. So we're looking. So what can we do for wood? Just to take very banally the one-to-one mapping from before. We're looking at objects, and this because the juggling. Then we can think of it in terms of patterns as well. Is this so useful that when we think of music? So like when I try to visualize music, which I can't do so good, but I see shapes, and I'm interested when you watch juggling. Is it do you see shapes?
This
or do you
is good.
see movements?
This is good.
Do you hear the juggling, or do you just have a texture?
What I try to tell the students also is that anything that man sees is two-dimensional.
Mm-hmm.
What adds the third dimension is in your head. Your eyes sees an image, a flat image. And if I really concentrate, I can put you and Jay beside each other, even though you are sitting much closer to me. Because this is what my eye sees, that to the left is Luke and to the right is Jay. Not that they are like that. That is what I think. So there is a big aspect to this. You are always in a two-dimensional image. You are always in a two-dimensional image. I think this one could think a lot about and try to keep in mind. Another thing is, which came to me right now when you asked, I don't know why, is Christopher Poolhem. Christopher Poolhem has made an alphabet of mechanics.
Mm-hmm.
He was a pupil of Emanuel Swedenborg in the 18th century, but he was not at all into this spiritualism and things.
Mm-hmm.
He was a constructor, an engineer, and he made an alphabet of engineering. So what are these wheels which go in each other, and what are these axes doing like this with each other, and all this, and a full alphabet.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think with 29 or even 35
Mm-hmm.
different characters in them. Mechanics and physics, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And as for mechanics and physics, why don't you, as it is still possible, get yourself a skeleton? It's a very interesting thing, a skeleton, with its joints and things where you can see, and you can start to juggle with the bones. But no, you can see a lot of how the constructions are, and if you know a little about how muscles do with then these bones, you will find out a lot about juggling. You will find out a lot about juggling. Just to sit and see this skeleton and draw it, and then you add little muscles and tenues on it, and how would it be if it was not like that, but like this? And then there was this strange girl in the domain who did handstand and rotated around her own shoulders. I still do not understand it really, but it must be some little there also. Still, I think jugglers and juggling and mechanics have got a lot with each other to do, and I really love this Japanese stuff with all these things. I think one could do lots of experiments with that. And then what I thought also much earlier in the conversation, but which I would love to put in, is this tension of borders, limits, going over limits, doing the impossible. Juggling is in all quietness and in all calmness. It is very much also doing the impossible. It's not only the trapeze people who fly who do the impossible things, but the jugglers are really experimenting with the impossible, and the impossible can always be done. So, in composition, there must be some kind of wall that shouldn't be there, or a roof, or a floor that shouldn't be there, because anything is possible. We can absolutely do vertical juggling or whatever. I mean, we can do things that couldn't be done, or you can. Jugglers can do things that cannot be done, and they should, of course. There, I dare say, should.
But I earned it because I had the should as well. So. Yep.
Yeah, the impossible. The impossible, the unimaginable, I think the UN thing is a good also thing to add into the plan of composition research. Impossible, unimaginable, incomprehensible, whatever.
So last question, two parts, and it's kind of related to what you just said. So what is the value, or what is, it's probably the wrong word, but of combining all these art forms? So here we're at a circus university at a dance school. There's a lot of talk about, for example, combining movement with juggling, or dancing with juggling, or theater with clowning with the trapeze. So this is this kind of composition question again, or combination, not composition, combination question, along with, if you care to comment on then taking it into this idea of what is the value of always finding something new. So one of the UN words could be unique, and we're always striving for unique and new and discoveries in this. So what
hopeless, bad. And then there is this Toulouse-Lautrec thing, and Toulouse-Lautrec, he says, I think in a conversation with his brother, yeah, at some time man invented the mirror, and he took the mirror and he put it on the wall, and it was very good and useful, and one could watch himself in the mirror in the wall. And then came some guy, and Toulouse-Lautrec doesn't say some stupid guy, he just says some guy. Then comes some guy and takes this mirror and puts it that way on the wall, just to have it in a new way. And it was absolutely idiotic, because you couldn't see yourself in the mirror anymore. So something new is really something which is pestering art in our time. New is not necessary, and necessary should be. So we don't have that. And then the relation, as for componists now and composition, the relation, for example, between juggling and something else. And you sit there and you do on your fiddle a little thing, and then you strongly feel there should be a drum. Or we are missing a flute here. And you juggle, and you feel that behind your back there should be someone doing, I don't know what, but something. Or, now I've finished, there should really come 10 bungee guys down now, going up and down in a stupid way, as different from this interesting thing which I just did. Or whatever, I mean, things that happen long for other things to happen, just like I long to meet you, or so. And thus, of course, if composition leads you to deal with trumpeters or acrobats, then interesting things are happening here. You thought that you were going into a research about juggling composition, and you find yourself composing the whole world. And then we are really back in the beginning, because then we are in the world context thing, where suddenly armies start to move on your arena, going into the sea like rats who drown themselves because we don't want armies anymore. But I mean, whatever. It's fantastic to talk with you guys.
Yeah. Sure is.
Okay.
Wow.